What if the person you defended against the entire world was never defending you at all? What if the love story you burned bridges for was actually a strategy memo in disguise? And what if, after years of sacrifice, isolation, and public humiliation, you discovered the truth not from an enemy, not from the media, but from her own private words? Because according to this alleged narrative, that is exactly where everything began. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a diary. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A quiet house in Montecito. The kind of quiet that only exists when something is already wrong. No cameras, no speeches, no carefully curated statements. Just the sound of pages turning and a man realizing, line by line, that the life he thought he was living may never have been real. Imagine that moment. You sit down expecting reassurance. Maybe nostalgia, maybe clarity. You tell yourself you're overreacting, that you've been under pressure, that the world has been cruel, and this will ground you. And then you read a sentence that changes how you see everything. He was never the goal. He was the gateway. Let that land for a second. Not a husband, not a soulmate, not a partner in love or rebellion. A gateway. And if that sentence alone didn't destroy him, the one that followed allegedly did. A pawn in my game. Now ask yourself, how would you react if you were him? Would you cry? Would you scream? Would you deny it? Fold the page? Tell yourself it was taken out of context? Or would something colder happen instead? Because this story, this alleged account, isn't about a sudden explosion. It's about a slow internal collapse. The kind that happens when the final puzzle piece slides into place and suddenly, everything makes sense. The arguments that never quite resolved. The battles you always seem to fight alone. The sacrifices that only ever went one direction. All of it. For years, the world watched Prince Harry as he unraveled in public. They argued about blame, about influence, about whether he was protecting his family or being manipulated. Some saw love, others saw control. Everyone had an opinion, but almost no one asked the most dangerous question of all. What if he was never meant to last? What if, from the very beginning, the relationship was built not on forever, but on access? This alleged diary doesn't describe passion the way love letters do. It doesn't ache. It doesn't plead. It calculates. It maps. It frames people as stepping stones, moments as leverage, and suffering as collateral damage. And that's what makes this story matter now. Because when public narratives collapse, private truths become unbearable. Picture Harry at that point in time. A man who had already lost his mother. A man who had already broken with his family. A man who had already been reshaped, criticized, mocked, and isolated on a global stage. A man who believed, truly believed, that all of it had been for love. Now imagine discovering that love was never the objective, that you were chosen not for who you were, but for what you unlocked. Palaces, platforms, powerful circles, global relevance. You weren't the destination. You were the key. And here's the part most people miss. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about humiliation layered on top of sacrifice. Because according to this alleged account, the diary didn't just describe strategy, it justified the damage done to him along the way. Criticism? Necessary. Estrangement? Inevitable. Public backlash? Acceptable losses. Not shared losses. His losses. And that realization, that the pain you absorbed was not accidental but anticipated, is what allegedly flipped a switch inside him. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times can someone tell you they love you, while designing a life where you bleed for the plan? How long before devotion turns into disillusionment? For years, Harry was framed as impulsive, emotional, unstable. But what if that was the pressure building inside someone who sensed, deep down, that something was wrong, even if he couldn't yet prove it? What if every time he defended her publicly, a part of him felt hollow, but he ignored it because love requires faith? And then one day, faith meets ink. Private ink. Words never meant for him to read. Words that don't soften when read aloud. Words that don't apologize. Words that don't love back. And suddenly, the story he told himself collapses. This is where the tone of the story changes. Because according to this narrative, Harry didn't explode immediately. He didn't storm through the house. He didn't throw the diary. He didn't confront her right away. He sat. And in that stillness, something terrifying happened. Clarity. He began replaying moments. not emotionally, but analytically. The way certain connections were prioritized. The way certain people were tolerated while others were cut off. The way conflict always seemed to leave him smaller. And with every memory, the diary didn't feel shocking anymore. It felt confirming. That's the most dangerous kind of betrayal, the kind that answers questions you were too afraid to ask. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And here's the detail that makes this alleged moment so chilling. According to the story, the diary didn't describe him as weak. It described him as useful, which is worse. Useful people are kept only as long as they serve the mission. And when missions change, so do loyalties. This is why the opening of this story isn't loud. It's quiet. It's a man alone with the realization that the person he built his life around may have been planning her next move long before the last one finished playing out. That the love story sold to the world was not written for romance, but for positioning. And in that moment, everything Harry had been defending turned against him. The media attacks he endured suddenly felt less random. The estrangement from his family felt less tragic and more functional. The public ridicule felt less like collateral damage and more like something already accounted for. And if that's true, if even partially true, then this isn't just a marriage imploding. It's an identity shattering. Because who are you when you realize the role you played was never equal? When you weren't the partner, but the platform? The diary allegedly ends without remorse. No second thoughts. No guilt. No doubt. Just forward momentum. And that's when Harry, according to this narrative, stood up. Not in rage. In resolve. Because once you understand you were never loved for who you are, staying becomes impossible. But leaving? Leaving requires something else entirely. And the next step, the moment he closed the diary, walked through the house, and prepared to confront the woman who wrote him into her strategy, was the point of no return. Because what came next wasn't about love. It was about power. And once power shifts, nothing is ever the same again. What if the marriage everyone thought they understood was never the marriage that actually existed? What if the love story that dominated headlines, documentaries, podcasts, and public debates was only the visible layer, while something colder, more calculated, lived underneath? Because before the diary, before the confrontation, before the words that allegedly shattered everything, there was a story the world swallowed whole. And that story matters. Because it's the very thing that made the betrayal so devastating. This chapter begins there. Not in Montecito. Not with anger. Not with exile. But with belief. Belief is powerful. Belief makes people forgive red flags. Belief makes people rewrite memories. Belief makes sacrifice feel noble instead of foolish. And Prince Harry believed. He believed in a narrative so convincing that millions of strangers believed it too. A prince meets an outsider. A rebel finds his equal. A wounded man finds love that finally understands him. It was framed as destiny. From the earliest days, their relationship was presented as inevitable, as if history itself had been waiting for this collision. He was the spare who never fit. She was the woman who challenged the system. Together, they were supposed to change everything. And for a while, it worked. Publicly, at least. Look back at the early footage. The smiles. The protective gestures. The language of unity. The insistence that this was different from anything that came before. Ask yourself, did it feel rushed? Some people said yes. Others called it passion. But speed is easy to excuse when the story feels righteous. Because who wants to question love when it claims to be healing trauma? Harry didn't just fall in love. He anchored his identity to it. This relationship wasn't just romance. It became a mission, a shield, a justification for every rupture that followed. Family tension. Love demanded it. Public criticism. Love could withstand it. Walking away from everything familiar. Love made it necessary. And here's where the contradiction begins. Because love is supposed to soften conflict, not multiply it. Yet as the months turned into years, conflict followed them like a shadow. No matter where they went, something was always wrong. Someone was always against them. Another bridge always seemed to burn. And Harry absorbed it. Watch closely and you'll notice something subtle. He was always explaining, always clarifying, always defending decisions, defending boundaries, defending statements that somehow needed defending at all. When criticism came, he took it personally. When blame was assigned, he shouldered it. When tensions escalated, he spoke as if it was his responsibility to justify everything. Why? Because in his mind, this wasn't manipulation. It was protection. That's what belief does. It reframes imbalance as devotion. He spoke about safety, about fear, about history repeating itself. He framed the outside world as dangerous, invasive, cruel. And many people believed him, because grief has credibility. But here's the uncomfortable question. Why did the danger always seem to point outward, never inward? Why was the solution always distance, never dialogue? Why did the narrative demand isolation as proof of love? The marriage the world thought it knew was built on constant motion, new homes, new projects, new explanations, new grievances. But stability never arrived. And when stability doesn't arrive, people either question the journey or double down on the story. Harry doubled down. He defended choices that confused even his closest allies. He stood firm as relationships with family members deteriorated. He spoke about freedom while seeming increasingly constrained. And from the outside, people debated endlessly. Was he brainwashed? Was he finally free? Was he protecting his wife? Was he being controlled? What almost no one considered was this. What if he was doing exactly what he thought love required? Without realizing the definition of love he was operating under had been quietly rewritten. Because love, when framed as survival, becomes non-negotiable. And that's the version Harry seemed to believe in. A love that demanded loyalty above all else. A love that framed doubt as betrayal. A love that positioned the world as hostile by default. In that framework, questioning the relationship itself becomes impossible, because the relationship is positioned as the only safe place left. Now pause here. Ask yourself honestly. How many people stay in situations that hurt them because leaving would mean admitting the entire premise was wrong? Because admitting that doesn't just end a relationship. It dismantles identity. Harry wasn't just married. He was invested. Publicly. Emotionally. Historically. To walk away wouldn't just be personal, it would be symbolic. So instead, he explained harder. He defended louder. He absorbed more. And here's where the story grows darker. Because while Harry was losing pieces of his old life, the public narrative framed it as growth, as bravery, as self-actualization. But growth doesn't usually feel like constant loss. And yet, loss became routine. Family connections faded. Long-standing friendships disappeared. Familiar institutions turned adversarial. And still, the narrative held. Why? Because the story was too powerful to abandon. The world had already chosen sides. And Harry had already chosen his. Until the diary. Because according to this alleged account, the diary didn't contradict the love story directly. It undermined it quietly. It didn't say he was hated. It said he was useful. That distinction changes everything. Because if the relationship was never about shared vulnerability, but about access, timing, and positioning, then all of Harry's sacrifices stop looking mutual. They start looking strategic. And that's why this chapter matters. Because you can't understand the explosion without understanding the illusion that came before it. The marriage the world thought it knew was built on repetition, repeating the same explanations, the same grievances, the same warnings about danger and control. But repetition isn't proof. It's reinforcement. And reinforcement only works until something breaks the loop. The diary did that. Because suddenly, the pattern he had been living inside wasn't framed as love anymore. It was framed as a system with roles, a system where suffering wasn't accidental, it was anticipated. And that's the part that allegedly made him feel sick. Because suffering for love feels tragic but noble. Suffering for strategy feels humiliating. And once that realization begins to form, it doesn't stop at one memory. It spreads. Moments that once felt like misunderstandings begin to look intentional. Arguments that felt emotional begin to look tactical. Decisions that felt reactive begin to look planned. And the marriage the world applauded starts to feel like a performance with a script only one person had read. That's when belief becomes unbearable. Because belief can survive doubt, but it cannot survive clarity. And clarity doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, like a weight settling in your chest. And according to this narrative, Harry didn't confront her immediately because he wasn't angry yet. He was recalibrating. He was replaying the entire relationship with a new lens, and realizing that the story he thought he was living may never have been the real one at all. Which brings us to the moment everything changes. Because the next chapter isn't about love. It's about discovery, about how that diary came into his hands, about why he opened it, and about the first sentence that made his stomach drop before he even reached the words that would ultimately end the marriage. Because once you understand how the illusion was built, you'll understand why it couldn't survive the truth. And what came next would change everything. Because the diary was never supposed to be found. Chapter 1 complete. Go. What if the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden, but simply assumed to be safe? What if the thing that destroyed everything wasn't exposed by an enemy, a journalist, or a leak, but by familiarity? Because the diary didn't surface through betrayal. It surfaced through proximity, through routine, through the quiet confidence that no one would ever look. This chapter begins with that assumption, that false sense of security. Because according to this alleged account, the diary wasn't locked in a safe. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't buried under layers of protection. It existed the way many private truths do, close enough to touch, but far enough to be ignored. And that's what makes this moment so unsettling. Imagine a house you've lived in for years. Every corner familiar, every drawer predictable. You stop seeing what's there because you assume you already know. That's how secrets survive. Not through force, but through complacency. According to this narrative, the diary entered Harry's orbit during an ordinary moment. Not an argument, not a confrontation, not a dramatic unraveling. An ordinary day, the kind of day where nothing feels dangerous, the kind of day where curiosity feels harmless. And that's important because intent matters. This wasn't suspicion-driven. This wasn't a man searching for evidence. This wasn't paranoia. This was proximity colliding with intuition. There had been tension, yes, distance, an unspoken weight that hung in the air, but nothing that screamed disaster. Just unease, the kind you can't name, but can't ignore either. You know that feeling, don't you? When something feels off, but you don't have proof. When you start questioning your reactions. When you tell yourself you're overthinking. When you tell yourself love requires trust. Harry had been there for a long time. And here's where the contradiction sharpens. Trust kept him from searching. But trust didn't erase the discomfort. And discomfort has a way of surfacing when defenses are down. According to the alleged account, the diary appeared in his awareness almost accidentally. A stack of papers, a personal notebook, something that didn't scream importance, but carried weight. The kind of object that feels personal without being alarming. And here's the moment most people don't want to imagine. The moment where you hesitate. Because once you cross that line, once you open something you know wasn't meant for you, there's no going back. Harry allegedly stood there longer than he'd admit. Not because he feared what he'd find, but because he feared what opening it would say about him. What does it mean when you feel compelled to look? Is it betrayal or self-preservation? Is it insecurity or intuition? That question alone can paralyze someone who has spent years defending the idea of trust. And yet, something pushed him forward. Not anger, not resentment. Curiosity laced with dread. Because curiosity doesn't always come from suspicion. Sometimes it comes from silence. And the silence in that house had grown heavy. So he opened it. Not dramatically, not expecting revelation. Just a page. And this is where the story shifts from tension to shock. Because according to the narrative, the opening lines weren't emotional. They weren't poetic. They weren't even particularly harsh. They were clinical, observational, detached. The kind of language you don't associate with love, but with planning. He read slowly at first, trying to place context, trying to understand tone, trying to convince himself this was just reflection. But the words didn't soften. They didn't wander. They didn't circle emotion. They organized it. And that's when his stomach dropped. Because you can feel when something isn't written for intimacy. You can feel when words are meant to document, not connect. As he turned the page, the distance grew clearer. The entries didn't speak about partnership. They spoke about positioning, about timing, about momentum. They referenced people the way chess players reference pieces, not emotionally, but functionally. And Harry appeared not as a lover, but as an asset. Now pause here. Imagine realizing that your presence in someone's life was analyzed, not cherished. That your value was measured in what you could unlock, not what you could share. That realization doesn't arrive as rage. It arrives as nausea. And that's what this chapter hinges on. The physical response. According to this account, Harry didn't immediately read the most devastating lines. Those came later. First came confusion, then disbelief, Then the slow, creeping sense that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Because misunderstandings carry emotion. This. How many times have you absorbed discomfort because you believed it served something bigger? Harry had done that repeatedly. He had accepted discomfort as loyalty. He had accepted silence as strength. He had accepted loss as the price of love. But pawns don't choose the board. They don't see the full game. They're moved. And when he reread that line, slowly, deliberately, he didn't see cruelty. He saw confirmation. Because pawns are useful precisely because they are expendable. And that realization doesn't just hurt emotionally. It humiliates existentially. According to the narrative, Harry sat there longer than he realized, staring at that sentence as if it might change if he looked away and back again. It didn't. The words stayed cold, detached, certain. And certainty is the hardest thing to argue with. This wasn't written in the heat of conflict. This wasn't venting. This was reflection. The kind people do when they think they're alone with their thoughts. And that's why it carried weight. He flipped back through earlier pages, not frantically, methodically, looking for contradiction, looking for doubt, looking for remorse. But the tone stayed consistent, analytical, strategic, observational. There was no maybe. No, I feel conflicted. No, this hurts me too. Instead, there were assessments, pros and cons, trade-offs. And suddenly, Harry realized something that made his chest tighten. The diary didn't frame him as someone who changed her life. It framed him as someone who enabled it. That distinction is brutal. Being loved changes someone. Being used accelerates them. And the pages suggested acceleration, not transformation. This is where memory began to rearrange itself. Moments he had once interpreted as intimacy now looked like information gathering. Questions that felt curious now sounded tactical. Silences that felt emotional now felt deliberate. And here's the contradiction that nearly broke him. She had often spoken about authenticity, about truth, about breaking free from manipulation. And yet, the most authentic words he'd ever seen from her were these. Private, unpolished, unperformed. And they didn't match the image she projected. That's when the emotional beat shifts. Because betrayal isn't just about being lied to. It's about realizing the liar knew exactly what they were doing. The diary framed decisions not as reactions, but as steps. Step 1, access. Step 2, insulation. Step 3, narrative control. And somewhere between those steps was him. Not at the center, but at the threshold. The gateway. That phrase echoed louder the longer he sat with it. Gateway. A passage. A means to an end. Not the destination. And here's the question that allegedly haunted him in that moment. If I was never the goal, what happens now that the gate has been crossed? Because strategies don't need loyalty once they've succeeded. They need maintenance. And maintenance isn't love. It's management. Harry allegedly felt something shift inside him. Not explosive anger, but something colder. Distance. Because emotional distance is what happens when trust dies quietly. He stopped trying to defend her in his mind. He stopped rationalizing tone. He stopped reframing. Instead, he let the words exist as they were. And they weren't kind. He reached another entry. Shorter, blunter, written without flourish. He believes it's about us. That helps. That sentence didn't scream malice. It whispered efficiency. And efficiency is terrifying when it's applied to human relationships. Because efficiency strips away emotion. It doesn't care how something feels, only whether it works. At that point, Harry wasn't reading anymore. He was auditing his own life, his own decisions, his own sacrifices. And that audit didn't balance. He thought about moments where he had hesitated. Moments where something felt off, but he'd been reassured. Moments where concerns were framed as insecurity. Moments where questions were framed as disloyalty. He had accepted those framings because love asks us to trust before we understand. But the diary suggested trust had been anticipated, planned for, used. That's when the shame hit. Not because he loved her, but because he had defended the story publicly, so forcefully, that now he couldn't escape it quietly. The world didn't just watch his marriage. It watched him justify it. Every interview, every statement, every explanation. And now those defenses felt weaponized against him. Because if he admitted the truth, even to himself, He'd have to admit that the person he'd become was shaped by someone else's strategy. That hurts in a way betrayal alone doesn't, because it attacks identity. Who am I if the version of myself I presented was built on a lie? And here's where this chapter reaches its most dangerous point. Because according to this account, Harry didn't feel hatred toward her. He felt something worse. Irrelevance. Not to the world, but to the plan. Because once the plan is in motion, the pawn's importance diminishes. And that's when fear enters. Not fear of confrontation. Fear of replacement. Fear of being managed rather than partnered. Fear of being tolerated rather than chosen. He closed the diary again. This time, he didn't reopen it. Because there was nothing left to confirm. The pattern was complete. The narrative coherent. And clarity, once achieved, doesn't need repetition. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the quiet, manicured landscape. And for the first time since leaving everything behind, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Sovereignty. Not anger. Not grief. Agency. Because understanding your role in someone else's game gives you the power to leave the board. But leaving the board isn't simple. Because pawns don't usually walk away. They're removed. Unless they choose otherwise. And that choice, the decision to stop participating, was forming now. Slowly. Deliberately. Without drama. Harry wasn't preparing a speech. He wasn't rehearsing an argument. He wasn't seeking closure. He was preparing for a shift in power. Because once you realize someone has been playing a game with you, the only winning move is to stop playing. And the next chapter begins with that decision. The moment where clarity turns into action. The moment where silence becomes movement. The moment where he walks back into that shared space. Not as a pawn, but as someone who has just stepped off the board. And when that happens, the game changes. What if the most devastating truth isn't that you were used, but that you were never meant to stay? What if the realization that finally shattered the illusion wasn't emotional, but logistical? Because once Harry understood the role he had been assigned, a darker question surfaced, quietly, relentlessly. If I was the gateway, what happens after the gate has been crossed? This chapter begins there. Not with confrontation, with arithmetic. Because strategy has a life cycle. And according to this alleged account, Harry began to see it everywhere. He didn't rush. He didn't spiral. He didn't reach for comfort or distraction. Instead, he slowed down, mentally rewinding the relationship like footage played at half speed. And the slowed version revealed details the emotional version had blurred. Timing, for example. The way milestones aligned with opportunity. The way certain relationships were accelerated while others were discarded. The way urgency always appeared when access was at stake. Harry began connecting dots he'd never allowed himself to connect before. Not because he couldn't, but because doing so would have collapsed the story he needed to survive. But survival was no longer the objective. Truth was. And truth doesn't ask permission. It intrudes. It reframes. It demands reckoning. As he replayed memory after memory, one pattern stood out more clearly than all the others. Every major turning point in their relationship coincided with expansion. Not emotional expansion. Strategic expansion. New circles. New platforms. New influence. Each leap forward was accompanied by a narrative crisis that justified drastic change. And Harry had always been the justification. The protector. The voice. The shield. He was the one who framed departures as necessity. The one who explained ruptures as safety. The one who absorbed backlash while insisting it was worth it. But according to this alleged diary, those ruptures weren't regrettable. They were useful. That's what made the phrase, "he was never the goal," so lethal. Because goals are endpoints. Gateways are temporary. And preventing yourself from seeing that difference requires constant emotional labor. Harry had done that labor willingly. Because believing you are building something together is easier than accepting you are being moved through. And that's where the realization sharpened. If the relationship had been structured around access, then permanence was never guaranteed. It was conditional. Conditional on relevance. Conditional on utility. Conditional on compliance. That's when fear crept in. Not loud fear, not panic, but the slow, constricting kind. The kind that asks questions without answers. What happens when the gateway becomes unnecessary? What happens when the access has been secured? What happens when the optics shift? Harry didn't want to believe that the answers applied to him. But the diary didn't speak in hypotheticals. It spoke in past tense, future tense, strategic tense. It spoke as though the crossing had already happened, as though the door had already been opened, as though his purpose had already been fulfilled. And that realization didn't inspire confrontation. It inspired assessment. Because confronting emotion invites negotiation. Confronting structure demands exit. Harry began noticing how the diary framed movement, not togetherness. Language like next phase, momentum, leverage, position, none of it implied settling. None of it implied permanence. None of it implied reciprocity. Instead, it implied progression. Forward. Always forward. And if someone is always moving forward, what happens to the people standing behind them? They're left, or they're dragged. Harry had been dragged for a long time. Dragged through conflicts he didn't fully understand. Dragged through reputational storms he didn't create. Dragged into narratives that painted him as reactive, volatile, unstable. And yet, he stayed. Because staying was framed as loyalty. But loyalty to what? To love, or to momentum? That distinction began to burn. And once it burns, it doesn't stop. Harry thought about moments where he had expressed doubt. Moments where he had questioned direction. Moments where he had wanted to slow down. Each time, urgency had overridden reflection. Now or never. This is the moment. If we don't act, we lose. Lose what? That question had never been answered clearly. Because the answer was assumed. Access. And once access is achieved, urgency evaporates. But what replaces it? Maintenance. Control. Containment. Harry allegedly felt his breathing slow, not because he was calm, but because he was bracing. Because something inside him understood what this realization demanded. He wasn't being asked to fight. He was being asked to decide. Stay inside a structure that no longer served him. Or step outside and reclaim authorship. That's when the internal monologue changed tone. It stopped asking why. It started asking when. When did this begin? When did love become leverage? When did partnership become positioning? When did he stop being a person and start being a passage? The answers weren't clean. They never are. But the direction was unmistakable. And that's when Harry did something subtle but profound. He stopped imagining reconciliation. Not because he was angry, but because reconciliation only matters when both parties share the same destination. And according to everything he'd read, the destination had never been mutual. The destination had always been elsewhere. Harry had just been the road. And roads don't get thanked. They get traveled. This realization didn't explode outward. It imploded inward. Because accepting it required letting go of hope. Not hope for love, but hope that the story could be fixed. And once hope dies, clarity becomes unbearable. Harry stood again. This time not to pace, but to ground himself. He touched the walls of the house. The furniture. The space he had defended publicly as sanctuary. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage set. Temporary. Curated. Replaceable. He wondered how long it would have lasted if he hadn't read the diary. Another year? 2. Until the next pivot? Until the next expansion? Until his role shifted from gateway to liability? That thought tightened something in his chest. Because realizing you were never meant to last forces you to confront something else. The possibility that leaving is the only act of self-respect left. But leaving isn't clean. It isn't cinematic. It isn't easy. Leaving means chaos. Narrative warfare. Public speculation. Emotional fallout. And Harry knew that. He had lived inside the consequences of public rupture before. He understood the cost. But now, the cost of staying felt higher. Because staying would mean consenting to erasure. Consenting to being managed. Consenting to being useful without being valued. And once you see that clearly, you can't unknow it. Harry didn't rehearse what he would say. He didn't plan a confrontation. He didn't even decide on timing. Because something more important had already happened. He had chosen himself. Quietly. Internally. Irreversibly. The confrontation would come, but not as a negotiation. As a declaration. And the next chapter begins with the most dangerous moment in any unraveling. Not the explosion. The pause before it. The moment where one person knows the truth and the other doesn't yet realize the game has ended. Because when someone believes they're still in control, they make mistakes. And those mistakes have consequences. And what happened next, the first words exchanged after that realization, would ignite everything. Because once the gateway decides to close, the fallout is inevitable. And no one sees it coming. What if the most devastating truth isn't that you were used, but that you were never meant to stay? What if the realization that finally shattered the illusion wasn't emotional, but logistical? Because once Harry understood the role he had been assigned, a darker question surfaced, quietly, relentlessly. If I was the gateway, what happens after the gate has been crossed? This chapter begins there, not with confrontation, with arithmetic, because strategy has a life cycle. And according to this alleged account, Harry began to see it everywhere. He didn't rush. He didn't spiral. He didn't reach for comfort or distraction. Instead, he slowed down, mentally rewinding the relationship like footage played at half speed. And the slowed version revealed details the emotional version had blurred. Timing, for example. The way milestones aligned with opportunity. The way certain relationships were accelerated while others were discarded. The way urgency always appeared when access was at stake. Harry began connecting dots he'd never allowed himself to connect before. Not because he couldn't, but because doing so would have collapsed the story he needed to survive. But survival was no longer the objective. Truth was. And truth doesn't ask permission. It intrudes. It reframes. It demands reckoning. As he replayed memory after memory, one pattern stood out more clearly than all the others. Every major turning point in their relationship coincided with expansion. Not emotional expansion. Strategic expansion. New circles. New platforms. New influence. Each leap forward was accompanied by a narrative crisis that justified drastic change. And Harry had always been the justification. The protector. The voice. The shield. He was the one who framed departures as necessity. The one who explained ruptures as safety. The one who absorbed backlash while insisting it was worth it. But according to this alleged diary, those ruptures weren't regrettable. They were useful. That's what made the phrase, "he was never the goal," so lethal. Because goals are endpoints. Gateways are temporary. And preventing yourself from seeing that difference requires constant emotional labor. Harry had done that labor willingly. Because believing you are building something together is easier than accepting you are being moved through. And that's where the realization sharpened. If the relationship had been structured around access, then permanence was never guaranteed. It was conditional. Conditional on relevance. Conditional on utility. Conditional on compliance. That's when fear crept in. Not loud fear. Not panic. But the slow, constricting kind. The kind that asks questions without answers. What happens when the gateway becomes unnecessary? What happens when the access has been secured? What happens when the optics shift? Harry didn't want to believe that the answers applied to him. But the diary didn't speak in hypotheticals. It spoke in past tense, future tense, strategic tense. It spoke as though the crossing had already happened, as though the door had already been opened, as though his purpose had already been fulfilled. And that realization didn't inspire confrontation. It inspired assessment. Because confronting emotion invites negotiation. Confronting structure demands exit. Harry began noticing how the diary framed movement, not togetherness. Language like next phase, momentum, leverage, position. None of it implied settling. None of it implied permanence. None of it implied reciprocity. Instead, it implied progression. Forward. Always forward. And if someone is always moving forward, what happens to the people standing behind them? They're left, or they're dragged. Harry had been dragged for a long time. Dragged through conflicts he didn't fully understand. Dragged through reputational storms he didn't create. Dragged into narratives that painted him as reactive, volatile, unstable. And yet, he stayed. Because staying was framed as loyalty. But loyalty to what? To love, or to momentum? That distinction began to burn. And once it burns, it doesn't stop. Harry thought about moments where he had expressed doubt. Moments where he had questioned direction. Moments where he had wanted to slow down. Each time, urgency had overridden reflection. Now or never. This is the moment. If we don't act, we lose. Lose what? That question had never been answered clearly. Because the answer was assumed. Access. And once access is achieved, urgency evaporates. But what replaces it? Maintenance. Control. Containment. Harry allegedly felt his breathing slow, not because he was calm, but because he was bracing, because something inside him understood what this realization demanded. He wasn't being asked to fight. He was being asked to decide. Stay inside a structure that no longer served him, or step outside and reclaim authorship. That's when the internal monologue changed tone. It stopped asking why. It started asking when. When did this begin? When did love become leverage? When did partnership become positioning? When did he stop being a person and start being a passage? The answers weren't clean. They never are. But the direction was unmistakable. And that's when Harry did something subtle but profound. He stopped imagining reconciliation. Not because, but because reconciliation only matters when both parties share the same destination. And according to everything he'd read, the destination had never been mutual. The destination had always been elsewhere. Harry had just been the road. And roads don't get thanked. They get traveled. This realization didn't explode outward. It imploded inward. Because accepting it required letting go of hope. Not hope for love, but hope that the story could be fixed. And once hope dies, clarity becomes unbearable. Harry stood again, this time not to pace, but to ground himself. He touched the walls of the house, the furniture, the space he had defended publicly as sanctuary. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage set, temporary, curated, replaceable. He wondered how long it would have lasted if he hadn't read the diary. Another year? 2. Until the next pivot? Until the next expansion? Until his role shifted from gateway to liability? That thought tightened something in his chest. Because realizing you were never meant to last forces you to confront something else. The possibility that leaving is the only act of self-respect left. But leaving isn't clean. It isn't cinematic. It isn't easy. Leaving means chaos, narrative warfare, public speculation, emotional fallout. And Harry knew that. He had lived inside the consequences of public rupture before. He understood the cost. But now, the cost of staying felt higher. Because staying would mean consenting to erasure, consenting to being managed, consenting to being useful without being valued. And once you see that clearly, you can't unknow it. Harry didn't rehearse what he would say. He didn't plan a confrontation. He didn't even decide on timing. Because something more important had already happened. He had chosen himself. Quietly. Internally. Irreversibly. The confrontation would come, but not as a negotiation. As a declaration. And the next chapter begins with the most dangerous moment in any unraveling. Not the explosion. The pause before it. The moment where one person knows the truth and the other doesn't yet realize the game has ended. Because when someone believes they're still in control, they make mistakes. And those mistakes have consequences. And what happened next, the first words exchanged after that realization, would ignite everything. Because once the gateway decides to close, the fallout is inevitable. And no one sees it coming. What if the most painful part of betrayal isn't the discovery, but the replay? What if the moment that finally breaks you isn't the confrontation, but the quiet audit that comes before it? Because after clarity comes memory. And memory, when re-examined, is merciless. This chapter begins inside Harry's mind, where the past stops being comfort and starts being evidence. He didn't need the diary anymore. It had already done its job. Now, the memories took over. At first, they came softly. A laugh at a dinner table, a hand on his arm during an interview, a reassuring squeeze before a public appearance. Moments he had once treasured, moments he had defended, moments he had used to silence doubt. But now those same moments replayed differently. Not emotionally, logically. He began asking questions he had never allowed himself to ask. Why that timing? Why that phrasing? Why that insistence? And most importantly, why did so many pivotal moments in his life coincide with moments of leverage for someone else? Memory is dangerous when you stop romanticizing it. Because once you remove intention, patterns emerge. Harry replayed the earliest days first. The intensity, the speed, the urgency, how everything felt like now or never, how slowing down was always framed as fear, how hesitation was always framed as weakness. At the time, it had felt like passion. But passion doesn't rush you away from your support system. Fear does. And strategy does. He remembered the early warnings he dismissed. Friends who asked careful questions. Family members who expressed concern. Not accusations, concern. He had interpreted those concerns as threats, as jealousy, as misunderstanding. Now, he wondered whether they had simply seen something he refused to see. Because love, when real, doesn't require you to defend it constantly. It speaks for itself. But his relationship had required endless explanation. To the public, to his family, to himself. Harry replayed the conversations where he had been encouraged, subtly, persistently, to choose sides. Us versus them. Safety versus control. Freedom versus oppression. And each time, the choice had been framed as obvious. Moral. Necessary. But now he noticed something else. The framing always removed nuance. It collapsed complexity into urgency. And urgency is a powerful tool. Urgency forces decisions before reflection. It demands action before understanding. It makes dissent feel dangerous. Harry remembered how often urgency had been used to move him. Move homes. Move allegiances. Move narratives. Every major shift had been justified by an imminent threat. And yet, the threat never quite resolved. It just changed shape. That's when a deeper realization surfaced. If danger is always present, then control can always be justified. Harry replayed arguments next. Not the explosive ones, the quiet ones. The conversations where something fell off but couldn't be named. Where his concerns were met with reassurance that somehow made him feel smaller. Where disagreement was reframed as misunderstanding. Where boundaries were framed as betrayals. He remembered times he had tried to assert himself, only to feel guilty afterward. Times he had apologized without fully understanding what he had done wrong. Times he had been praised for loyalty immediately after expressing doubt. That pattern is subtle and devastating because it trains you to associate self-erasure with peace. And peace is addictive. Harry replayed public moments next. Interviews. Statements. Speeches. He heard his own voice defending choices that no longer felt like his. He heard himself explaining motivations that now felt borrowed. He saw how often he had spoken in absolutes. How rarely he had expressed uncertainty. And he realized something that made his stomach drop. He hadn't been lying. He had been convinced. Which is worse. Because when you believe the narrative, you don't question your role in spreading it. Harry replayed the fallout moments. The family estrangements. The friendships that faded quietly. The invitations that stopped coming. He had told himself it was necessary. That this was the price of independence. That anyone who didn't understand wasn't worth keeping. But now he asked a harder question. Who benefited from his isolation? Because isolation doesn't just remove enemies. It removes witnesses. Harry had become harder to reach. Harder to contradict. Harder to ground. And that realization made his chest tighten. He replayed moments of vulnerability. Times he had spoken openly about trauma. About fear. About history repeating itself. And he realized those moments had been powerful. Powerful not just emotionally, but strategically. Because vulnerability earns sympathy. And sympathy earns leverage. Harry wasn't accusing himself. He was recognizing how vulnerability had been positioned, used, amplified, timed, and that hurt in a way anger couldn't touch. Because it meant his pain, real, raw, unfiltered, had been part of the machinery. Not honored, not protected, deployed. That's when the replay intensified. He remembered how often he had been encouraged to tell his story publicly. To reclaim his voice, to speak his truth. But now he noticed something chilling. The truth was always framed in ways that supported the same outcome. Distance, severance, finality. There was no room for reconciliation, no space for complexity, no allowance for evolution, only rupture. Harry replayed moments where he had felt relief after burning a bridge. Relief that quickly turned into loneliness. Loneliness that was then reframed as proof of how dangerous the outside world was. A perfect loop. And loops are hard to escape once you're inside them. Because every exit feels like betrayal. Harry replayed the private moments too. The nights where he had felt uneasy but couldn't explain why. The mornings where he woke up tense for no clear reason. The subtle feeling of being behind his own life. Of reacting instead of choosing. Of explaining instead of living. He had told himself it was stress. Public pressure, media intrusion, but stress usually fluctuates. This had been constant. And now he understood why. Because when you're living someone else's momentum, rest feels wrong. Stillness feels dangerous. Silence feels threatening. And that's when the diary's language came back to him. Momentum, position, leverage. He realized the diary hadn't just described a plan. It had described a worldview. A worldview where people are instruments. Where relationships are routes. Where outcomes justify methods. And he had been inside that worldview without realizing it. The replay reached its breaking point when he remembered moments of joy. Real joy. Laughter without tension. Calm without urgency. Moments that felt grounded. And he realized something devastating. Those moments almost never coincided with advancement. They happened in pauses, in stillness, in spaces that weren't productive. And those spaces had always been temporary, interrupted, cut short, redirected, because stillness doesn't serve momentum. Harry felt something inside him harden. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. Because replaying memories this way wasn't punishment. It was preparation. He wasn't torturing himself. He was orienting himself. Because once you see the pattern, you can anticipate the response. And Harry began anticipating. If he confronted her emotionally, she would redirect. If he questioned intentions, she would reframe. If he expressed pain, she would contextualize. Because strategy doesn't apologize. It rationalizes. And that meant the confrontation had to be different. It couldn't be reactive. It couldn't be pleading. It couldn't be framed as hurt. It had to be framed as fact. That's when Harry stopped replaying. Because he had reached the end of the pattern. And the end of the pattern revealed something crucial. He didn't need to convince her. He didn't need validation. He didn't need closure. Because closure is a concept for people who believe the story was mutual. This wasn't mutual. This was directional. And the direction had never been toward him. Harry stood again, not abruptly, but decisively. He felt heavier, but also steadier. Because the replay had done its job. It had stripped away illusion. And illusion is what keeps people stuck. He knew now that when he spoke, it couldn't be about feelings. It had to be about boundaries. Because boundaries end games. And that's when he heard movement in the house. Footsteps. A voice. Normalcy returning. The illusion reasserting itself. And for the first time, Harry didn't feel pulled back into it. He felt separate, observant, prepared. Because the next interaction wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a collision. Between narrative and reality. Between strategy and refusal. Between someone who believed the game was still being played. And someone who had already stepped away. And when those two states meet, there is no compromise, only fallout. Because the next chapter begins with the moment memory gives way to confrontation. The moment where replay becomes reality. The moment where everything unravels, not in the mind, but out loud. And once words are spoken, they can't be taken back. What if the most chilling realization isn't that someone hurt you, but that they expected you to endure it? What if the pain you thought was accidental was actually anticipated? Because after the replay came something darker, something colder. Something that didn't just explain the past, but reframed it. This chapter begins with a single, devastating shift in perspective. Harry didn't just realize he had been used. He realized his suffering had been budgeted, planned, accounted for. And once that thought takes hold, it changes everything. At first, it arrived as resistance. No, that can't be right. No one plans someone else's pain. No one knowingly sacrifices the person they claim to love. But the diary language wouldn't let him escape that conclusion. Because it didn't describe fallout as tragedy. It described it as cost. And cost implies acceptance. Harry began revisiting not just moments, but outcomes. The backlash he endured. The ridicule. The headlines. The reputational damage that stuck to him long after explanations faded. He had told himself it was unavoidable, that it was the price of standing up. But now he asked a different question. Unavoidable for whom? Because somehow, the damage never landed evenly. It clung to him, to his tone, to his image, to his credibility. He was framed as unstable, impulsive, emotionally volatile, while she remained composed, articulate, strategic. And suddenly, that imbalance didn't feel coincidental. It felt engineered. Harry remembered moments where he had been advised to stay quiet, to take the hit, to absorb criticism because responding would make things worse. Moments where he had been positioned as the emotional shield. And shields don't get thanked. They get worn down. He remembered how often he had been praised for resilience, for strength, for enduring pressure. And now he understood why. Endurance had been part of the plan. He thought back to specific incidents, moments when public backlash surged unexpectedly, when narratives turned harsh overnight, when blame concentrated on him with startling efficiency. At the time, he had rushed to defend, to contextualize, to explain. Now he saw the pattern. Those surges always followed moments of advancement. A new project, a new partnership, a new platform. And when momentum required sacrifice, he was the one pushed forward. The diary language echoed again. He will endure it. Not we will manage it. Not this will be hard for us. He, singular, isolated. That pronoun haunted him because it revealed expectation, and expectation reveals intent. Harry realized something deeply unsettling. The diary didn't express guilt about his suffering. It expressed confidence in it. Confidence that he would absorb it. Confidence that he would keep going. Confidence that he wouldn't break. That kind of confidence only comes from observation, from experience, from precedent. She had learned, over time, that he would stay, that he would defend, that he would endure. And endurance had become a resource. Harry felt a flash of anger then, but it didn't last. Because anger implies surprise. This wasn't surprising anymore. It was explanatory. An explanation, when it's complete, doesn't leave much room for rage. It leaves room for grief. Not grief for the relationship, but for himself. For the version of himself who believed suffering was proof of love. For the version of himself who thought loyalty meant silence. For the version of himself who mistook endurance for devotion. Harry remembered moments where he had pushed himself past limits. Emotionally, mentally, physically. Moments where he had felt overwhelmed but told himself to keep going. To be strong. To not make things harder. And now he wondered, harder for whom? Because if his breaking point had been anticipated, then his well-being had never been central. It had been expendable. That realization hit him harder than betrayal ever could. Because betrayal suggests deviation. This suggested design. Harry began to see how often his pain had been reframed as purpose. You're strong enough to handle this. This is part of the journey. This is necessary. Necessary. That word appeared everywhere once he noticed it. Necessary to move forward. Necessary to prove resilience. Necessary to justify distance. Necessary to maintain momentum. Necessary to control narrative. And necessary sacrifices always come from someone. They just rarely come from the person declaring them necessary. Harry realized that his pain had been useful precisely because it was visible. Because visible pain creates sympathy. And sympathy creates leverage. And leverage creates power. It was a system, not chaos. And systems don't apologize. They optimize. Harry thought about how often his emotional reactions had been highlighted, amplified, analyzed. He thought about how often he had been framed as reactive while she remained measured. How often he had been the emotional one while she appeared composed. And suddenly, that dynamic didn't feel accidental. It felt strategic. Because in public narratives, credibility follows composure. And if one person absorbs emotional damage, the other retains authority. Harry realized that by enduring publicly, he had unintentionally transferred power. His vulnerability had been genuine, but its usage had not been neutral. That realization didn't make him hate her. It made him feel used in a way that couldn't be undone. Because you can forgive cruelty. But how do you forgive someone who planned your suffering? Harry thought about how often he had been encouraged to relive trauma publicly, to share, to expose, to be honest. And honesty had been framed as healing. But now he saw another layer. Honesty had also been content. Content that fueled narratives. Content that sustained relevance. Content that kept attention focused. And while he bled emotionally, momentum continued. That realization made him physically still. Not tense. Not shaking. Still. Because stillness is what happens when the final explanation clicks into place. He realized the diary hadn't framed his suffering as unfortunate. It had framed it as manageable. And that was the moment he knew something had ended permanently. Because love does not manage pain. It seeks to prevent it. Harry felt a shift then. A severing. Not dramatic. Clean. Like a cord being cut internally. Because once you realize someone expects you to endure pain for their vision, you can't unsee it. And you can't unknow what that means. It means the relationship wasn't about mutual care. It was about output. And output doesn't rest. Harry realized something else that was even more unsettling. His endurance had not just been expected. It had been relied upon. Because the diary implied confidence, not concern. Confidence that he would stay. Confidence that he would absorb. Confidence that he would continue playing his role. And that confidence existed because he always had. Until now. That's when Harry understood why clarity had arrived when it did. Not because the plan failed, but because the plan succeeded. The access had been gained. The positioning achieved. The narrative established. The gateway crossed. And once crossed, the gateway becomes less important. Harry realized he had reached the point where endurance would no longer earn him protection. It would only prolong his usefulness. And that realization forced a decision he could no longer delay. Stay and continue to be managed. Or leave and reclaim agency. But leaving would require confrontation. Not emotional confrontation. Structural confrontation. And Harry understood something critical. If he framed his departure as pain, it could be negotiated. If he framed it as betrayal, it could be reframed. But if he framed it as boundary, there would be no counter.